Good morning, and thank you for coming. I've given many talks here on history, on religion, existentialism, to values, on history, and today let's talk about me, shall we? This is my memoir, and no one is more surprised that it exists than I am. In fact, no one's more surprised that I became a writer than I am. When I was growing up, I had a pathologically low self-image, and my teachers convinced me that not only did I hate writing, but I was no good at it. But fortunately, my senior year, I had one English teacher who forced us to write in a journal for 10 minutes every day. Best advice anyone ever gave me. And so if you start writing every day without even knowing it, you get better. And then something else happened. I ended up in teaching, and I have brothers, and there's tremendous sibling rivalry, and of course no one knows how to press your buttons like a brother. And they knew I was passionate about teaching, and they, who had never set foot in a public school classroom, they knew what needed to be done. And so I would begin to argue with them, and they could see how angry they were making me, which only egged them on even more. And I would fight them with data and research, and I just could never win. And then I would resort to telling a story. What was it like in a classroom? And that always shut them up. You can't refute a story. And I found that my stories silenced him, and they just said, you should write these down. And so I started to, and that ended up, I sent them in to try to become a columnist for the local newspaper. Was initially turned down by this editor. He said, well, there are changes coming up. So I waited a year, and every day when I drove by the newspaper, I used to flip them off going, and then a year later I resubmitted 10 more, and this time I was called in. It turned out that the change was that editor was fired. And the new editor hired me, and to my amazement, I wrote for the next 18 years. And the only reason I stopped is because the newspapers I was writing for were all swallowed up by the big bad, huge newspaper, and they fired everyone, including my editor. So that was the end of that. But anyways, when you're done, I had over 500 of these that were stories about my life in the classroom, my life traveling, my life growing up, and I arranged them in a more or less chronological order. And so I'm going to read selections from them today. And trying to choose was like asking a parent, well, who's your favorite child?
Right.
And so that was tough. But let me begin, and I probably will need the 10 and 5 minute notice. And I'm almost destined to go over it, but anyways, it'll help me start cutting in the end. This is from the preface. And I'll just begin this with I'll finish this, I'll give it at the end. In 1981, fresh out of college, I ventured out to discover the world and myself. While waiting for an overnight ferry to carry me from England to Ireland, I strolled at sunset atop the bluff overlooking the Celtic Sea. I watched a small white gull, golden with twilight, hover wind-wavering just a few meters above me. To my surprise and delight, the gull followed me as I continued along the path. Was he an omen? The Holy Spirit assuring me that I would never really travel alone? I was quite religious at the time. Or just a simple bird joining me in savoring the beauty and wonder of the moment? It was an auspicious beginning to a nearly 2-year odyssey, my first of many. The adventure would lead me to the depths of a small cafe in rain-drenched Santiago de Compostela, Spain, where I doubted my journey and myself completely. To the heights of a frozen ridge in Los Picos de Europa, where, with ice axe, crampons, and intrepid newfound friends, I climbed my first breathtaking summit. To a small after-hours English language school on the Iberian Peninsula's northern coast, Santander, where unwittingly I fell in love with teaching. To so many unimagined places, people, and discoveries which subtly, profoundly marked me forever. Nonetheless, it's the mystical moment with the gull I've treasured most. and I wonder if it will be the final memory I let slip just before I breathe my last. It defined me, instilling a deep-seated, unquenchable longing to ever be on the precipice of yet another adventure. Even now, now I'm retired, and whenever I was driving to school on what would be just one more mundane morning, I often sang the same words I did during that first glorious gallivant so long ago. The song an anxious Maria sang in The Sound of Music, just before her foray into the wide world. What will this day be like? I wonder. What will my future be? It could be so exciting to be out in the world, to be free. The song reminds me that each day can be a journey, perhaps even an adventure, especially in the life of a teacher. After all, my students never fail to surprise me or to make me laugh. I see so much of myself in these children. Most long to venture out someday to discover the world and themselves. Oh, if only I can keep such a precious spirit alive in their hearts as well as mine. What follows is a loosely organized chronicle of other such rambles. The memories and musings I've gleaned from a half-century of rambling about life, schools, and the world. I wrote most of them piecemeal over 18 years for the Argus and the Daily Review, part of the Bay Area News Group. But where to start? Maria knew. Let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. So I'll start long after I met that mysterious goal high on the British cliff. I'll start with another auspicious beginning, my traumatic birth. And you can't hear me, or?
Not really.
Aha.
Just pull it out a little bit from the popping.
Yeah, well, if I pull it out, they can't hear me, so.
Pull it out a little bit and then talk.
How's that? A little bit better? There we go.
There you go.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Chapter 1 is called The Gift and explains the title. Can you hear me now?
No.
Yes.
Sorry.
It's imperfect.
A month before I was supposed to be born, my umbilical cord ruptured, sending my mom and me to the hospital, bleeding profusely. There's no hope for your baby, the doctor informed my distraught dad, and you better pray for your wife. Dad drove my 3 older siblings to St. Margaret Mary's Church near Cleveland, Ohio, told them to kneel at the altar and pray like they'd never prayed before. When they asked what for, we replied frantic, "Just pray." I was born by emergency cesarean section. The doctor at the Catholic hospital took one look at me and baptized me on the spot, certain I would soon perish. A few minutes later, a nurse repeated the sacrament for the same reason. Counting my formal baptism back at St. Mary's afterwards, I've been baptized 3 times. When my mom woke up, groggy from blood loss and anesthesia, she asked the nurse, hoping against hope, "How was my baby?" It was a boy. My mom collapsed back onto the pillow and grieved. It was a boy, she heard, assuming the nurse had put my death as tenderly as possible. And on the 3rd day, intone that with sanctimonious melodrama, please, the family pediatrician visited my mom. "What are you doing here?" she asked in despair. "I've come to see your baby." "My baby's dead." "No, he's not." The pediatrician hurried out and returned a few moments later with the miracle baby, me, incubator and all. He's doing just fine. My resurrection is now the stuff of legend in the Ellison family. Recounted countless times at reunions. Its telling includes how angry my mom later became with her brother, Jerry. When she proudly unwrapped the blankets to show me off, he burst out laughing. "Gosh, when we get them that small, we throw them back." After one such retelling, my mom whispered to me, half in jest and half in earnest, the same advice she'd given my brother Tim, who'd also once flirted with death. "You know, if I were you, I'd be worried. God's kept you alive for something."
Yeah.
Unlike my mom, however, I've long doubted providence. Apparently even 3 baptisms weren't enough to make my faith stick. If, however, it turns out that there has been a divine plan for my life, I suspect my teaching and my writing have been essential to my purpose on earth. One thing is for sure, I am fortunate to be alive, living on borrowed time. Attending the funerals of some of my young students has driven that realization home poignantly. And so I felt a special responsibility to live this life well. I used to repeat to myself that wonderful but severe adage, live every day as if it were your last. One of these days you'll be right. I've since modified it to my own liking. Live every day as if it were a gift, and every day you'll be right. Let me savor that gift and make good use of it. The first part, I talk about rambling about life, rambling about schools, and rambling about the world. The first part is about rambling about life, sort of what made me me. And I've got a few columns about a few key teachers, and this is one about one of them. The title is Poe. The specter coming down the hallway frightened me. Absurdly tall, with a large shock of unkempt black hair and a deeply lined, forbidding face, he swung his cane relentlessly to and fro in front of him. He seemed a bizarre morphing of an Edgar Allan Poe horror story and an elongated, dreary El Greco painting. However, his gaping, vacuous eyes, which were forever tearing, as if from some terribly somber vision they alone could behold, yes, his eyes were the most unnerving. Poe was an apt name for him. Pity the poor undergrad who had him for a professor. The first day, second semester, I gasped silently when Poe entered my humanities seminar, and wiping his sightless eyes, introduced himself as Stephen Rogers, the instructor. By spring break, however, I had a new name for him. Tiresias, the blind seer, the implacable prophet. It had quickly become obvious that it was I, not he, who was blind. Patiently, sagely, Tiresias opened my eyes to the great books. Works by Thucydides, Homer, Dante, Descartes, Kant, Shakespeare, Aquinas, Nietzsche, the dead white men now in such disrepute. I still recall as if it were yesterday his haunting reading of T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. For the first time, I began to appreciate the tremendous beauty of words and the power of the ideas they conveyed, even though I could still only barely understand them. I changed my major to the liberal arts. The arts of symbol making and symbol using, Tiresias explained. The symbols we use to describe and ultimately to create our world and ourselves. Pre-unemployment, my father lamented dryly. But Tiresias won out. He awed me. Indeed, I was afraid to speak during my first classes with him. Who wouldn't be in the presence of a prodigy who could nonchalantly recite obscure epic poems in 5 languages? But through a persistent mix of cajoling, goading, and easy laughter, Tiresias drew me out, igniting all the passion and curiosity I hadn't even known I possessed. Eventually, he couldn't shut me up, and often accused me of throwing intellectual hand grenades in the midst of many class discussions. Finally, one day, it was I who insisted on reading aloud a passage from Plato's Apology, Socrates' stoic response to the judges who'd sentenced him to die. Death has caught me, the old man. Evil has caught you, the young. Now I must suffer my fate, and you must suffer yours. That was very fine, David, Tiresias commented after a pause. Thanks, Doc, I replied flippantly, and the nickname stuck. Dr. Stephen Rogers, alias Doc, coached me through my final tortuous 40-page senior essay on the songs. He engendered within my soul a fierce love of learning, a deep belief in the potential nobility of man, and he gently nudged me in the direction of, quote, the most honorable of all professions, teaching. Poe Tiresias Doc. He was my nightmare, my idol, and in the end, my friend. He didn't just teach, he inspired. And that is what education is all about. This is to my parents. I dedicated this to my parents. The jet airplane took a little over 5 hours to fly from Oakland to Cleveland, carrying me on my yearly pilgrimage home for Christmas. In the ethereal world at 33,000 feet, the tranquil limbo between my harried life in California and the more sedate lives of my family in Ohio, I couldn't help but finally pause and reflect. An unrepentant vagabond, I marveled to find myself living where I lived, doing what I did. It occurred to me that my parents, who were waiting to greet me at the airport, must be similarly amused to see who I'd become. And for the first time I realized that it was they who long ago had given me the freedom to choose my own path. I remembered one incident which had seemed insignificant at the time, but which I finally recognized as a striking example of my parents' courageous restraint. My mom and dad had visited me during my freshman year in college because I'd landed a big part in a Shakespearean play. I played Romeo of Ephesus in A Comedy of Errors. After the performance, I brought them backstage to meet the director. "Dave's made quite a splash in the theater department here," she confirmed effusively. "We can see he's going to make a wonderful addition to the drama department." My parents politely smiled, but I could tell that they were stunned. They'd assumed my acting was merely a hobby, that I'd major in something practical like business or engineering. In fact, my dad had once commented that any liberal arts degree was a total waste of time and money. The following morning, my parents took me out to breakfast before their long drive home. The conversation was uncomfortable, strained. I could tell they wanted to dissuade me from a career in the theater. They brought up the subject only once, though. "Well," my father said, carefully stirring his coffee, "I suppose you'll get a lot of big parts here, since the theater department is so small." Mild encouragement, a bit of caution, but nothing more. How difficult it must have been for my parents to bite their tongues. I soon gave up the theater on my own, thank goodness. I wonder if I would have done so had my parents demanded it. But there were many other times in my life when my mom and dad forced themselves to remain mute while I went ahead and made apparently outrageous decisions. After graduation, for instance, I spent 2 years gallivanting through Spain. Upon my return, I accepted my first teaching job in Texas, of all places, for a paltry $8,000 a year. Was I crazy? In retrospect, I regret none of my choices. My many adventures, good and bad, prepared me well. I consider myself fortunate indeed when I see some of my friends languishing in careers their parents chose for them. And when I witness students struggling at a sport or an instrument they hate, but their parents enjoy vicariously. My mom and dad insisted only that I guard my integrity and get a good education. The rest they left up to me. They let me follow my heart. And that is why every Christmas, for as long as my parents lived, my heart always led me back to them. This is called The Homecoming. What would they think of us? After 26 years, my college roommate, Eric, finally dragged me, one of the University of Notre Dame's prodigal sons, back to our alma mater for a football weekend. I'd often begged Eric, if I ever returned like so many visiting alumni, sporting flowered Bermuda shorts and a potbelly, he should please just shoot me. And Eric had requested the same. In that one respect, we'd both come back in triumph, wearing only green sweatshirts and slim jeans. We reminisced over dinner in the South Dining Hall, surrounded by students so terribly young. What do they think of us? I wondered. Then a moment later, what if the students we once were could see us as we are now? What would they think of us? We brooded in silence. Eric had spent the majority of his undergraduate years ensconced in the library, overwhelmed by the fierce competition of the pre-med program. I learned to memorize, he recalled sadly, and enjoyed very little of it. Nonetheless, he'd since become the paragon of the Notre Dame alumni, still a devout Catholic, chief physician at his Midwest clinic, a devoted husband and father, and of course, a loyal Fighting Irish fan. Eric was also facing his second divorce, this time from a woman who, although she cared for him, was in love with a woman. What would Eric of old think of him now? I, on the other hand, had rarely finished the readings for my humanities seminars, and had completed the many essays only in a frantic flurry late at night. I'd been too busy with the chapel choir, the theater, the student union. Even so, it was at Notre Dame that I learned to love history and ideas and to contemplate a career in teaching them. Since then, however, I had consciously turned my back on so much of Notre Dame. The oppressive Catholic hierarchy, dogma, sexism, homophobia, and guilt, the relentless pursuit of recognition and success, the irrational worship of sport, the new opiate of the masses, especially football. My wanderlust had led me far away in distance and thought. Now I was nursing my own heartbreak, having recently abandoned with bitter no child left behind induced disillusionment my love affair with public schools, taking a 2-year leave of absence. And at the age of 48, although finally out of the closet, I still had not found a life partner, much less created a family. What would the Dave of old think of me now? How to explain to the cocky, naive 21-year-olds we were that they wouldn't be masters of their fate? Their futures, impossible to envision, would be shaped more by providence and fortune than their bold decisions. That their most important choices would involve a commitment to someone or something. That each would require unforeseen risk and sacrifice. Each would bring undeserved joy and grief. That the next quarter century would leave them cradling a baffling mess of gratitude, regret, and humility. Know we couldn't have understood. They'd have to learn for themselves, and they would. We did. After Boston College had added its name to the litany of teams defeating the Irish that year, I watched the Notre Dame players kneel in front of their fellow students, all of whom had stayed to the bitter end. The band behind the team struck up the alma mater and all sang, swaying together. It was as if the students were embracing the heartsick players with, "Yeah, you may be the losingest team in Notre Dame history, but you're still ours, and we love you." In that moment of disgrace, I rediscovered my school pride. Life will humble us all, even the great Notre Dame. And so we must love each other and our universities in spite of everyone's inevitable failings. Thus mine was a wistful homecoming. I finally understood what Notre Dame thought of me and I of her. For better and for worse, Notre Dame had helped make me who I was. Then, after my long, estranged absence, she'd welcome me home, embracing me as one of her own, warts and all. And I hugged back. Now, second section is about my teaching. How am I doing? I have no idea. Okay. This is called Don't Be an Actor. When I was a senior in high school, I landed the lead in a spring musical. I'd already learned to love the theater since it had finally gotten me out of my shell, convinced me I wasn't worthless after all, and filled me with an exuberant joy I'd never known before. Now I'd even gotten the lead. Why not make a life in the theater? I approached the director, Mr. Murphy, with an eager, breathless question. Do you think I have what it takes to be an actor? The answer, patently obvious to everyone but me, was a resounding no. Mr. Murphy was a wise and compassionate man, however. Rather than destroy me with the harsh truth, he replied with the sage one. That's the wrong question, Dave. Could you do anything else and still be happy? Of course, I replied. Then don't be an actor. It's just too hard. Meanwhile, the first glimmerings of my real vocation had already made their debut. In my U.S. history class, for instance, everyone had to make some sort of oral report. This was before I discovered the theater, when for me there was no nightmare more frightening than speaking in public. Nonetheless, as I stood trembling before the class in order to explain Civil War General McClellan's ill-fated march up the peninsula towards Richmond, latent gifts emerged of their own accord, in particular my flair for the dramatic and my knack for telling a good story. McClellan could have ended the war easily if only once across the Potomac he'd unleashed his army pell-mell towards a city that was scarcely defended. But although McClellan, hapless soul, was a genius at building an army, he was afraid to use it. He proceeded oh so cautiously, which I acted out, taking ponderous steps, my eyes anxious as I checked off each imaginary division behind me, allowing the Confederates time to prepare. McClellan hesitated yet more when scouts reported Confederate regiment after Confederate regiment marching across the clearing. The truth was, there was only one regiment that kept running back around through the trees, regrouping with different flags, and marching through the clearing again. I pantomimed that ruse out as well, using the teacher's desk as my forest prop. Caught up in the story, I couldn't help myself. When I was done, the class stared open-mouthed. Who are you and what have you done with that squeaky, stuttering Dave? The teacher, Miss O'Donnell, asked me afterwards if I'd ever considered becoming a teacher. Ha! I replied derisively. The scene repeated itself 7 years later in one of my first English classes I taught in Spain. A job I pursued, I claimed, only to make a living while in the country. I had no idea why the school hired me because during the interview, I'd stuttered even worse in Spanish. As I approached the classroom and a gracious colleague wished me luck, gracias was all I could muster. I was terrified. A few minutes later, I stared at 35 high school kids who gazed curiously back. Then another miracle occurred. I broke into a grin and introduced myself with a fluid, flawless Spanish I hadn't known I was capable of. Once again, something in my soul knew I was home. Many, many years later, after a 2 years leave of absence from teaching, I resigned a plum job as media relations manager for the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. Had I lost my mind? No. I just finally realized that even though teaching was a frustrating, exhausting, and maligned profession, like acting, just too hard. I couldn't do anything else and still be happy. And I have to say that I'm a very fortunate man to have sort of backed my way kicking and screaming into where I belonged. I was born to teach, and in the classroom it's sort of a crucible or a nexus of everything that matters. My love of history, my love of telling stories, my passion, my desire to make a difference, my high standards, it all comes into sharp focus in the classroom. That was where I belonged. I'm not going to get through even a third of these, but oh well. I tried to forget about Greg, how I let him down, leaving him utterly alone. But the gift he gave me, a clay statue of an Aztec king, still haunts me, denouncing me from atop my bookshelf, even as I write this. I still have it, by the way. It's in our house. I forgot to bring it this morning. At the time, the statue seemed an appropriate Christmas gift for a high school Spanish teacher. Now I realize that nothing then was as it first appeared. Nearly everyone considered Greg the most fortunate, enviable kid on campus. He was, after all, captain of the varsity track team. He excelled in all his classes, too, especially mine. Nonetheless, behind his easy success and his captivating smile, Greg hid a dark secret. He was gay. He never told me, of course, at least not with words. Yet in many other not-so-subtle ways, he revealed his desperate longing for acceptance, for companionship. I recall the day Greg first sought me out. It was after I had admonished a classmate for jokingly insulting another with the epithet faggot. Pardon me, I chastised, but that is very offensive even in fun. It's just as bad as any racial slur expressing prejudice against people who are different. I won't tolerate it in my class. At the end of the period, Greg lingered to tell me I was the first teacher he'd met who ever defended homosexuals. A sad statement indeed. After that, he stopped by often during lunch to chat, his questions becoming ever more personal. Was I married? Was I presently dating anyone? He seemed pleased when distracted munching on my sandwich. I shook my head. At Christmas, he timidly presented me with the statue. I really like your class. And you, Mr. Ellison. And then he grasped me in a clumsy hug. I was flattered, but I still didn't get it. Perhaps I was too young, too naive, or maybe I really didn't want to comprehend since I couldn't yet accept my own homosexuality. One evening a few weeks later, Greg came running up to me at a home basketball game. He insisted eagerly that I sit by him in the bleachers. But when I introduced him to the pretty woman at my side, I was still trying to be straight. His face collapsed. He stared at me wide-eyed, shaking his head in disbelief and betrayal. Then after muttering a choked, "Pleased to meet you, miss," he fled the gymnasium. At that awkward moment, I finally understood. Oh my God. I wish I had followed him or reached out at another time. I should have broached the taboo subject, assured Greg he was not evil or weird, and that above all, he was not alone. But I was afraid. What closeted teacher wouldn't be in a small Catholic homophobic high school in Texas? I tried to laugh off the incident to convince myself that I had misinterpreted Greg's behavior. He made it easy for me. He retreated obediently back into his own murky closet and never approached me again. Indeed, he even went on to become prom king. Surely he was not gay. But Greg's gift, the Aztec king on my shelf, still whispers otherwise. And he reminds me bitterly that in the end, I didn't deserve him. Now the good news is I ended up eventually coming completely out of the closet. I was an openly gay teacher, administrator, and columnist, but it took me a long time. I got 10 minutes left. Let me get this one. Do you want a funny one or do you want a heart-wrenching one?
Funny.
Funny. All right, let's skip that one. All right, I'll read this one anyways. I eventually became an administrator, and I had really great mentors, as you're about to see. The custodian found the empty beer can in the boys' restroom the third day of school in late August. Being a new middle school vice principal at the time, I merely shrugged my shoulders and sighed, "Well, what can we do?" "A lot, Miss Gold," the principal replied. "This is where and when we draw the line." She threw out her dragnet, interviewing the custodian to determine after which recess the can had appeared, and then the teachers on supervision to discover which boys frequented the restroom at the time. Because she knew all the kids so well, she could pretty well guess which ones had been involved and who had been their ringleader. Tony, Miss Gold concluded with grim certainty. The short drama began in her office moments later, which she staged artfully. She sat behind her desk, placing me and the other vice principal, Miss Soto, on either side of the hot seat in front of her. "Ready?" she quipped to Miss Soto, who nodded. In came Tony, looking startled to see the entire administrative team there in the office confronting him. After a long moment of silence, Miss Gold began, "So, Tony, how's it going?" He gulped and replied with a pubescent squeak, "Fine." "That's good, Tony," she replied. "Very good. So is there anything you want to tell me?" "No." "Really?" Miss Gold continued, staring at Tony fixedly, her relentless eyes a perfect counterpoint to her small catbird seat smile. "Nothing about the beer can on campus yesterday?" He shook his head convincingly. "Oh, nothing about the can on the floor of the boys' restroom during morning recess?" she continued, looking briefly at the paper on her clipboard. which I knew was merely the day's lunch menu. No? That's odd because Miss Thompson observed you, Freddie, Javier, James, she continued naming all his friends slowly, consulting the clipboard, entering that restroom during morning recess. Silence. Miss Thompson said, Tony, that you were all in there a very long time. Miss Gold had made that part up. Still, her eyes and voice were both now icy cold and hard, her smile long gone. Another silence dragged on excruciatingly. Finally, Miss Soto, seated to the left of Tony, administered the coup de grace. With her soft, sweet voice, she asked, "Where'd you find it, Tony?" He turned to her and blurted out frantically, "Under a bush!" The mythical bush where students claim they found all contraband. "You fool," I wanted to blurt out. "All you had to do was keep your mouth shut." "Thank you, Tony," Miss Gold replied. Then she discussed with him, sternly yet with obvious affection, why bringing the beer can to school had been so harmful to the school, to his friends, to himself, and all his goals for the new year. Tony having shared them during their intimate conversation. "Well, Tony, I'm going to let it go this time," she finished. "But there can't be another, no matter who brings it. You understand? Can I count on you?" Tony nodded gratefully, and with a gushing "Thank you, Miss Gold," he fled back to class. "Why didn't you suspend him?" I asked, incredulous. "David, there's policy, and then there's what's best for Tony and this school," Miss Gold explained patiently. "Tony gets into trouble frequently. If I suspended him now and get his year off on such a bad foot, I'd probably end up expelling him before the end of the year. Also, he's the leader of the 8th grade, for better and for worse. I'd like to teach him to be a positive one. He owes me now, and so we will be far more likely to be with us than against us. I do have high hopes for him, despite his awful home. What is more, word will spread. By lunch today, everyone in the 8th grade will know that a kid brought a beer can to school and we tracked him down the very next morning. I like that. This is how we try to run the school, David. Not with an iron fist, but with a strong but loving hand. And that's the kind of hand I want you to use as my new vice principal." I will say Miss Soto, her real name was Miss Vara. She pulled me aside the first day and said, "David, remember, we're teachers, not cops." I had good mentors. 5 minutes. Oh my God. All right. Probably won't get to the third part, but that's okay. I like this one. This is Kitty. I taught everything from 4th grade to college. This is one of my favorite 5 years in the 4th grade. Omar came to my attention after the first writing sample of the year in my new 4th grade class. His paragraph was nearly indecipherable, and his horribly misspelled words only barely held together with scant punctuation. He spoke English perfectly, even though Spanish was his native language, but he had evidently done very little reading or writing in either language. Helping Omar through our first book after school, a 2nd grade version of The 3 Pigs, had been grueling. He'd been unable to sound out even the simple words like straw, brick, and house. The situation seemed hopeless. Nonetheless, he returned later in the week to read most of the story effortlessly, even with playful, dramatic expression. He beamed when astounded. I showered him with praise. "Well, I read the story 6 times, he explained. "Wonderful," I answered. Let's go find you another book." Moments later, we were both seated cross-legged on the floor of the library between the shelves, making our way through a more difficult but far more interesting text about an African-American girl on her first bus trip to town alone. She'd had to stand in the back despite the many open seats up front. Omar listened to my explanation of the Jim Crow laws with horror, then eagerly turned the page. I paused and realized I was witnessing the magical moment when a youngster first glimpsed the power and joy of reading, the universe waiting just around the next page. I hadn't been a reading expert. I'd merely given him some one-on-one attention and guidance, and he blossomed. Reality came crashing down soon enough. I started helping other struggling students after school as well, and soon could no longer tutor Omar much. I tried pairing him up with another kid to read together, but that hadn't been as effective. Thus, both Omar and I recognized just how long and hard his road to real literacy would be. My math class disillusioned me as well. I'd hoped the kids working with their partners would correct their homework in 10 minutes or so. 40 minutes later, I found myself unsuccessfully stifling frustration while answering the same question yet again, the kids still not finished, some of them barely having started. Nancy, an identified gifted and talented student who sat in back, finally could stand it no more. She lay her head down on the desk, bored out of her mind. Normally, I'd call such a student back to attention. However, I thought to myself with sickening angst, she's making better use of her time than I am, and let her nap. Omar and Nancy in the same class with such different needs, and I was failing them both. I did my best to plan a better lesson for the following day. Even so, I went home utterly defeated. And since I didn't sleep well that evening, I returned the next morning still exhausted, still doubting my ability to teach at this new grade level, oblivious to the beauty of the day. Then little Tina bounced her way into class long before the first bell and came directly to my desk. I swiveled around in my chair to behold her face of boundless energy and enthusiasm, simple joy and trust. She hadn't noticed how awful a teacher I'd been the day before. No, she couldn't wait to make me laugh again. She did within seconds, and so dispelled all my depression and doubt. In their place, she left only gratitude. After all, my job was to nurture as best I could 33 such tiny, diverse, fragile, yet resilient bundles of life and hope. They all have the same amazing power over me, not only to make me laugh, but to make me believe in myself, in them, and in life. Section 3 is about traveling the world, but I'm out of time. So I'm going to skip that section. Just can't resist. Part of that deals with my arrest, where I spent 3 weeks in a Mexican prison. You'll have to buy the book. This is the end, which finally explains the title. Sally's postcard arrived like a love letter, not just from her, but from the city she'd been visiting, Santander. Santander, that beautiful town on the northern coast of Spain where fate had brought me after college, city of laughing sea and stoic mountains, winter rains and summer mirth, desperate loneliness and oh so kind welcome. Santander. How the memories came tumbling back, like so many disparate, long-forgotten pieces to a puzzle I'd never managed to put together. First, I recalled the Farol, the lighthouse out beyond the city, from where, forlorn and near despair, I braved the winds, stared out at the whitecaps, and strove to think great thoughts. I majored in the great books and so fancied myself a philosopher. Then I remembered the Sierra, Los Picos de Europa. On my first backpacking trip there, I rested outside a shepherd's hut, spellbound while the early clouds crept silently over the pass, then down into the canyon, already dark below. Oh, I'd left Ohio far behind. Wisps of faces and conversations came back too. My Spanish friends had despised Americans, at least the idea of them, but had sheltered and tutored me patiently. They'd spoken proudly of having fended off both the Romans and the Moors, only to finally succumb more recently to that fascist Franco. With whimsical bitterness, they pointed to a cannon Franco had used to pound the city into submission, now standing as an ironic monument, still aimed at the town center. Santander taught me history wasn't just a captivating story. Oh, to return to the small mom-and-pop carnicerias, panaderias, and ferreterias, where I'd stopped for meat, bread, and sundries. I've never escaped without some conversation with the owners, the other shoppers hushing at the sound of my Yankee accent, eager to collect juicy gossip for the neighborhood. but nodding in silent approval as my Spanish improved week by week. Claro, es maestro, they murmured. Of course, he's a teacher. They'd revered educators in Spain. Yes, it was in Santander that I'd unwittingly begun what became my vocation. I taught English at various schools throughout the city, armed with nothing more than my diploma, a contagious enthusiasm, an easy laugh, and a willingness to work hard. It was enough. It still is. All those dear recollections from one silly postcard. But Santander had been an adventure after all. One where I'd learned self-confidence, accepted humility, fell in love with teaching, and above all, felt my first real conscious joy at the simple, profound act of living. Santander made me who I am today. If I finally have any true great thought, Sally's postcard from Santander enabled me to assemble it from so many jigsaw memories, and it is this: adventure, taking risks, traveling either literally or figuratively, feeling lost, depending on new friends, and finding one's way back home again, changed forever. This is one of the great purposes of life, whether you're rambling on borrowed time or not. And the only education that matters is not one that raises test scores or promises an ever-elusive financial security. No, real education prepares us, that inspires us to make that lifelong adventure to Santander or wherever. And I have to say, one of the things that fills me with great sadness is because I'd inherited a few $1,000 from my grandparents, was able after college to go abroad.
Yeah.
And immerse myself in a foreign culture, and that changed me forever.
Yes.
And that is an opportunity that is lost to almost all college graduates today, because they graduate up to their ears in debt.
Yeah.
And it is a terrible shame, and frankly, I don't think anyone should get a liberal arts degree if they have not spent one of the years of their college education abroad, immersed in a foreign culture. Thank you for listening.
Excellent, David. Yeah, excellent. It never ceases to amaze me the talent we have at Lakeside. If you have any questions for David, please raise your hand and wait for the mic. I'll come round. If you enjoyed today's presentation, and how could you not?
Yeah.
Please spread the word about Open Circle. Let your friends know, because I feel sorry for the people not here today. Wonderful presentation. Next week we've got Ed Tasker. It's going to be great. So spread the word. Questions?
David, that was inspiring. You're a wonderful writer. So the question I have for you, since you were, and still are, into theater, and you're a good writer, have you ever thought about writing a script, play?
That's a good question.
About Barbara.
So much.
I have found that I'm pretty darn good at telling stories about true things that I've seen and experienced. Making up stories, I'm a lost cause, a hopeless case, and so no, I read novels with awe at the ability of other people to create characters and plots. I'm reading right now one by Barbara Kingsolver that I'm just amazed at her characters and the way she structured the book. I'm just, no, I could never do that. Nor do I have time.
Okay, David, we have a question from Angel? Angelito.
David, I do admire you. You're a great speaker. You have a really nice sense of humor. I wonder, when did you come out? At what age? That you're so comfortable with your identity. And you have a wonderful husband.
Oh, by the way, Edgar, wave Edgar, he designed the cover of the book among his many talents. So And he actually convinced me of the title as well. I can't remember what I had. He said, Santander, that's the theme of your book. Put it on the cover, for God's sakes. And I just said, well, they won't even know how to pronounce it. And he just said, they'll want to read the book to figure out what it's about. So, anyways, but no one bought the book, so it's all his fault. I was, I didn't go in it, but a lot of these came from that column. There were a few parts, a few chapters that I wrote specifically for the book, and one of them was my coming out story, start to finish. And I knew I wouldn't have time today. But, you know, I went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, Catholic college, and then I taught in Catholic schools in Texas. And I believed all the garbage that was spewed, that you know homosexuals were pedophiles.
Yeah.
And I'll just tell you one thing. I had this deep, terrible secret. I mean, when I was growing up, anytime I looked at another boy that I had a crush on, I would have a physical. My stomach would, and I would run away, and I could never interact with that boy again. I just ran away, and that's the way I lived for most of my life. I was a monk, and then when I became a teacher, it got hard because I had this terrible, terrible secret that when I turned 30, and I realized I'd never had a significant relationship with anyone, and I turned 30, sort of a monumental year, and then for the first time in my life, I had decent health care, and I learned Kaiserite free counseling. I went to a counselor, and I made sure on the phone, I said, don't get me one of those gay therapists, I want a straight one, you know, and I went in, I said, you married, you have kids, and I'm sure he must have went, oh my God, and he was phenomenal for me. He was the perfect man, and the first thing he told me was, Dave, I can see you aren't in Christ. First thing he said, Dave, I can't tell you who you are, although he could have, but he realized I had to tell myself. He said, the first thing I can say is you need to stop running away. He said, go out and meet some gay people. They don't bite, and well, some of them do. Anyways, he gave me homework. He said, you aren't in crisis, I'll see you in 2 months. And then he had these half-on spectacles, and he said, now Dave, don't you dare come back here without something to report. So like any bad student, I didn't do a damn thing for 7 weeks. And then I was like, ah! So I finally went out and, went on a hike with the gay lesbian Sierrans, and it was mine, because I went to the trailhead, and, and I didn't understand it, because they looked normal. I guess I was expecting pink spandex and feathers or something. And then I pulled up my collar and pulled out my hat and just listened, and they talked about politics, whose turn it was to, and I thought, but they're normal. So it was a revelation to me. But the moment that I'm getting to in this rambling is at one time I learned to trust this counselor, and I shared with him the deepest, darkest secret that I had. And I turned to him with just angst-filled face, and I said, I think some of my male students are really handsome. And I was afraid he was going to have to, well, I am obligated by the state of California to turn you in, and you've lost your credential, and I have to protect kids. And instead he looked at me, and he could just see the look of angst and horror on my face. And he looked at me for a long moment, and then it was the perfect response. He burst out laughing. He couldn't stop laughing. He was guffawing. He had to take off his glasses and wipe his eyes, and he just kept saying, oh, David, David. I said, David, I can see that this has tormented you. He said, let me be the first to tell you, they're gorgeous. He said, you think the straight teachers don't walk in and notice the really beautiful youngsters that are in their classroom? And he said, I'm giving you homework. Tomorrow morning you are going to go into every classroom and go around to every boy and say, gorgeous, gorgeous, really gorgeous, not so gorgeous, gorgeous, and then let it go. Relax. You're a great teacher, and now you'll be an even better one. And so it was by learning to relax and accept, and once that deep, dark secret, I was able to turn and face and say, I can be gay and still be a good teacher.
Yeah.
And it became a very, very slippery slope. Because, first I came out to just some dear friends, and then I worked my way up to my parents. But then, long story short, we had this legendary superintendent who we'd heard through the grapevine that was somewhat gay-friendly, but he was about to retire. I was a mentor teacher. This other lesbian teacher, we were both mentor teachers. We knew how horribly gay students struggle and be saying, sit down and shut up, you've been talking too long. I know, and we knew how badly kids were suffering in school. And we were certainly not in a position, because we were terrified in the closet. And we said we should go to the superintendent and offer to give an in-service to all our colleagues on how to make our schools safe for LGBTQ kids. Very long story short, we did that for the next, however many years until I retired. It became one of the most gay-friendly districts anywhere. But my principal called me in before the first in-service, and she said, David, the highlight of your talk is going to be the panel of gay kids that you've got up here. And you've asked them to get up in front of everyone and come out to all their former teachers and stuff. And then she just looked at me and said, and you're staying in the closet?
Oh.
And I went, oh, I think I hate you. And so it wasn't just my principal's blessing, it was my principal's insistence that I come out to the staff and eventually to all the staff in the entire district. And once you've done that, it was just so liberating that eventually I came out in my column as well. I went to my editor and said, listen, I'm going to hand this one to you, but I'm coming out tomorrow. And he just looked at me and he said, duh. So, and it was, one friend said, Dave, you didn't just come out of the closet, you blew the door off the frickin' hinges. And I said, I was there until I was 32 or something like that. So it was, the scars of that closet will remain with me for my life. It's a horrible place to be. But I gave it a